Hey everyone, so in this video I want to talk about the Gurgenidze system and what is the most challenging way to face it, because honestly until like 20 minutes ago I didn't really understand the intricacies of the Gurgenidze system, and where, what makes the position okay for black and what makes it actually very quite bad for black. So what is the Gurgenidze system? It involves basically a combination of these moves g6 and c6, where black wants to play the move d5. In this e4 opening, let's say, black can try to go for the modern defense. This is a very common way to try to do this. And after d4, bishop g7, white can play c4 and just get the full center, but you have to be ready with to play against the king's Indian. But if white plays the move knight c3, ready to enter, maybe a Pirc defense or something, which I will make a video on after this, black can try to opt for this move c6. And yeah, and the point is that black wants to play the move d5 next, right? So in this position, there is a fundamental decision to be made. Do we want to put the knight on f3 or do we want to push the pawn to f4? Now, in practice, f4 is a very common move, but I think that this is a very controversial decision and one that is like quite dubious if you are unable to fully take advantage of black's setup. And so I actually recommend people to play the move either h3 in this position or the move knight f3, and I will explain why. So this move f4 is exactly what black wants. They want to put the pawn on d5, and essentially, I mean, they want to target your d4 pawn, so you have to advance the pawn forwards e5, right? Any other move doesn't make sense. And what happens is that black wants to set up this light square blockade by putting all of the pawns on, c6, d5, and e6, and later exchange this bishop on c8 by going out somewhere like this. And try to hopefully after knight f3 play the move bishop g4, and at a timely moment play the move bishop takes f3. So how this can happen is that black can start with the move h5. They want to take over some of the light squares here, right? And after, let's say, knight f3, they can even play the move knight h6 here, with the intention of going bishop g4 and then knight f5, putting the knight on a very nice outpost on f5 here. And so we see that the downside of white pushing the pawn to f4 and then later e5 and getting this sort of structure is that you've weakened all of the light squares in the position. So a sample line could go something like this. Bishop e3 makes sense before black is able to go knight f5, and then black plays bishop g4. And in this position, like even if you play, let's say, h3 in this sort of position, takes maybe, maybe it makes sense to play the move knight f5 first, bishop comes back to f2, takes, and then pawn to e6 or even pawn to h4 in this sort of position makes sense. And the reason that you want to play pawn to h4 is maybe just to prevent white's advance of g4, right? So that's why you play h4. And this position is, in my opinion, like very good for black. Like the reason is that, let's say after you play bishop d3 and e6, if white is unable to create enough counterplay, because white is actually like limited in the number of pawn breaks they could have. Like the only pawn break I see is right now pawn to c4, right? Pawn to g3 like makes no sense because you'll be giving up the draw to your bishop, and yeah, it just like makes no sense from a positional standpoint. So this position, because there's a lack of pawn breaks, I think the black is actually very comfortable. And let's see what happens. From if you play, let's say, bishop g4, then white plays a passive move like bishop e2. Then black gets a knight f5, bishop f2, and e6. And here I would argue that black is more than fine again, because they will later set up the pawn to h4. Even they can think about bringing this bishop back to e7, where it will be more useful than its placement on g7, right? Because it's currently not doing anything. So the bishop will come back to e7. Black will maybe castle manually, like maybe king f8, king g7, and maybe at some point break on the queen side with the move c5. And I think black gets a lot of counterplay here. So this is the ideal Gurgenidze system that you kind of want to avoid, I believe, is putting this pawn to f4. And so in this position, the most common move is the move knight f3. And then after d5, the most common move is h3, which I already think is an inaccuracy. It's like a big inaccuracy, and black is able to equalize here. So let's talk about this in the next chapter. So after e4, we'll just maybe bring these concepts into life when we're looking at a defense, like the Pirc defense. d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. So black is setting up the Pirc, and then one of the most challenging lines, and in my opinion the most challenging lines, is the move bishop e3. And black seems to have problems after this move. But let's see. a6. So with the move a6, I want to show that black is signaling that they want to play sort of a modern defense, but they don't want to commit the bishop on g7 yet, right? Because when they play the move bishop g7, it means that when you play queen d2 and bishop h6, they have to respond to it because there's like tension between the two bishops, right? So by playing a move like a6 here, they're kind of making a waiting move and saying that now what are you gonna do? If you play knight f3, you've blocked your f pawn. If you play queen d2, which is the best move, probably the best move, but actually I believe h3 is better. But queen d2 is also very good. There's essentially like some downside to each and every move, right, in the position. And I want to show you what happens if white plays the very logical looking f4. You know, just getting more space. But it turns out that black can actually transition this into a very good Gurgenidze system because they haven't put the bishop on g7. And because we understand that in the Gurgenidze, after d5, e5, okay, I mean, our center's under pressure, so we need to advance. And then black plays this move, knight g4. And this is the idea. The knight can't be captured because it's defended by the bishop. And after we drop the bishop back, let's say to c1, black plays h5 with similar ideas as before. But actually, this is a very good version because after, let's say, knight f3, and then now black plays knight h6, a very useful move because the knight wants to go to f5, right? And then let's say bishop e3, so that we don't, you know, we can drop the bishop back to f2 before black plays knight f5. Bishop f5 is quite possible, and then h3, e6, and bishop f2. And this sort of position, I mean, black could also play, you know, a setup with like bishop g4, bishop f2, and then knight f5 now. This is also very playable, I believe. But let's look at the option with bishop f5, which is slightly better in this specific variation. And after h3, preventing a piece from occupying g4, e6, bishop f2. It's important to understand that the reason this structure is not very good for white is because this bishop on f2 is a poor piece. And it ideally would love to be on the g5 square, where it could control all of the dark squares here. But black is just in time to play the move, let's say, knight d7. Okay, I mean, if you can play the move bishop h, maybe in this sort of position, but knight d7 is possible, but I would argue maybe bishop e7 is slightly more accurate, actually, so that you prepare the advance with h4, and you know, you don't allow white to play the move bishop h4 and take over the diagonal. So one consideration is after this one, maybe bishop h4 is possible. But yeah, computer doesn't seem to mind this exchange of the bishops, I guess because because black has essentially you know, they don't have like that many weaknesses on the dark squares if none of the knights can enter the position, right? So this is quite good, also good for black. But it also makes sense in this position for black to play the move bishop e7 first, so that now they can try to get some counterplay and try to play for the win actually with like h4, you know, keeping pieces on the board, king of a to g7, and eventually try to break with c5. And if white has no pawn breaks, black's position is very solid, right? So going all the way back, f4 is already an inaccuracy here, which may be surprising, right? Like that the refutation is probably just to enter a good version of the Gurgenidze system. So now, the reason that I want to mention that is because it often shows that, you know, why black delays a bishop coming to g7. So you need to be aware of that. You know, if black delays the bishop development to g7, they may want to transpose to a Gurgenidze system. And secondly, it's also important to play this move h3 in this sort of position because now, it's okay, this move has a lot of points to it, but the big point is that it prevents the move knight g4. And also, if you ever transition into a Gurgenidze, like let's say after bishop g7 and f4 here, it doesn't really work because you don't have the g4 square to reroute the knight to, and white can gain the center with e5. If the knight drops back, this is just not very good for black, and so they don't have this option of putting the knight on the light square here, right, and then playing h5 next. So let's say they play knight e4, and that this is just quite bad because the pawn on e4 becomes a big weakness, and white can immediately start putting pressure on it with g4, knight g3, bishop g2, and this pawn is simply lost. This is quite an ambitious setup, but it's very strong because black can't really challenge this g4 pawn. Like they can try h5, but will simply take. You know, I mean, gh5 just leaves them with you know, with an inactive rook. So rook takes h5 makes some sense, but after knight g3 and the bishop g2, this pawn on e4 is lost, right? So transitioning into the Gurgenidze is not good if black is not able to play the move knight g4. So that's another point. Okay, and then let's lastly discuss the last thing. Let's look at the different move orders that black can try to enter the Gurgenidze with. Because we saw that they could try to enter it with the modern defense move order, or even the Pirc defense. But let's look at it with the c6, d4, and then the move g6 here. They can, of course, go to the Caro-Kann, and after, let's say, e5, they go for g6. This is possible. We will look at this variation in the main line. But also, if white plays knight c3, and then they play g6 here, this is also quite possible, right? Okay, so let's look at it through the main move order, which is e4, c6, d4, g6. And so now the reason I want to show this move order is because it gives white an additional opportunity here to play the move c4. Now, the thing about the move c4 is that you enter more like King's Indian sort of struggles, but this is a good version because black is unable to play d5, right? Let's say bishop g7, knight c3, and then they'll eventually have to play d6, and you get some sort of position like this, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e3, and white should just be better here and should have very good chances to play for an advantage with this sort of better version of the King's Indian, because black has played d6 and c6, right? Which is not really useful in conjunction. So that's one option. Another option is just to simply go for knight c3, and after d5, this is the big decision that we have to make. Now, the main move that people have been playing in this position, and the reason that I struggle also against the Gurgenidze is because the main line is h3, and I thought that this was like a useful move, because if you want to play knight f3, you kind of want to maybe prevent bishop g4, right? But this main line is actually already an inaccuracy, and it allows black to basically equalize in my view. After d takes e4, knight takes e4, black can play the move knight f6. Similar to the Tartakower variation of like the classical Caro-Kann, let's say after after e4, c6, d4, d5, yeah, 4, d5, this position with knight f6 is very similar to the position that we just saw, right? And essentially black is also fine here because there's just the inclusion of g6 and h3, which, it's a very similar position essentially. But yeah, let's look at this one. After h3, d4, knight takes e4, knight f6, and then, if we don't take, then what do we do, right? So we have to take here, and then let's say we put our pieces on the most natural and good squares. And let's follow the main line here, knight c4, bishop c4, castles. Here it makes sense for black to try to gain associated with a5, maybe trying to prepare b5 and a4. So now white should play a4, but in this sort of position, black plays a move like knight e6 and tries to simply occupy the d5 square. So maybe it makes some sense to kind of, support opponent d4, but after knight c7 and, let's say bishop e6, black is perfectly equal. Like, there's nothing to be said about this position. Like, these double pawns will eventually, be nice to control the center this way, and white has no advantage here. So this is the problem. It's like the database doesn't really help you, and if you play this move h3, black is fine after g takes e4. The most common move in the database is bishop g7, but then after e5, we will now enter a good version of the Gurgenidze, which I will explain. But h3 is inaccurate because now black can take on e4. So, what does this say? What does this tell you? It tells you after knight c3 and the d5 here, we should play the most critical move e5, just gaining more space. And it seems like this knight on c3 doesn't belong here because it's blocking the c-pawn from, being able to move forward. But this knight is actually quite useful to control the e4 square. And, even in a lot of positions, in a lot of Caro-Kann positions, this makes a lot of sense to put the knight on c3, just for the fact that it controls the center. We don't always need to defend our center with c3, right? We can always meet c5 with takes. And let's see here. If they continue with bishop g7 here, a very useful move, an important move is h3. And essentially, we get in knight f3, we get in bishop d3, and we get in castles. And black is unable to set up the typical Gurgenidze because this pawn on h3 covers the g4 square, and black is unable to get this bind, as we saw. Also notably, after the bishop comes to g7, it also makes some sense to play the move f4. And because the bishop is not on e7, where it controls the h4 square, very importantly, it means that this position is also just better for white. But I suggest that you play the move h3 here, and you should have a nice advantage, a very easy one. But if you play f4, which is quite playable, let's see, black can start with h5, knight f3, knight h6, very typical, bishop e3, bishop g4, h3 takes. And this position is also quite good because at some point white can play g4, but let's say knight f5, here bishop f2, makes some sense. But I would argue even that the move g3 makes also a lot of sense here. With the point that it just prevents the pawn from coming to h4, right? Because this sort of position would probably be, e6 runs into g4 here, which is probably something that you shouldn't allow. But after h4 here, probably black just plays e6, bishop f8, bishop e7, and it's probably just fine here, actually. So that's why you probably have to go for something in g3. And, just saying that you can take the bishop, but this bishop wasn't good to begin with. But, you exchange a lot of pieces, and this isn't exactly ideal, right? If you want to try to play for an advantage. So, which is why going back here, h3 makes a lot of sense, just to keep a lot of pieces on the board and not being so committal by putting the pawn on f4, because the bishop can actually go out on this square. Like, if you ever play the move h5, let's say, like, I don't know, like, if you ever play the move h5, white can always occupy the g5 square with the bishop, and the bishop is so much better on g5 than it is on e3, right? Okay, so let's see, in this move order, if black plays the move bishop f5, and then h3, h5, knight f3, e6, and now we can see that the downside or basically the upside of not including the move f4 is that we have access to this move bishop g5, right? And for, let's say, bishop e7, queen d2, white has, ideas of long castling, as well as even rook g1 and g4, just hitting the bishop. And this is this provides white with a big advantage in this sort of position. So to recap, the important features of the Gurgenidze system is that you don't really want to, you kind of want to gain space with this move e5. And secondly, ideally you don't want to put down pawn on f4 because it blocks in your own bishop. Also, the third point to notice is that the bishop on g7 is a bit worse than going to e7 in the Gurgenidze system, because as you saw with the bishop on e7, it prepares the move h5 and h4, right, to get a clamp on the king side. So those are the three main takeaways that I hope you get from this video, and also that you don't fall into the trap of playing the move h3, which is the most common move in the database. And yeah, that was also an introduction to the important ideas that you need to know if you play against the Pirc defense, because as you saw, it's very easy to get the lines mixed up, and so you need to play in a very accurate and a very precise way to deal with the Gurgenidze system. So thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.